where there is no central hierarchical authority that will tell us what it is exactly we should be saying or doing, is also an exciting situation. So clearly, if we do agree that this emerging media is both a site of great control, but also a site of great resistance, you politically have an idea that one of the big struggles we were going to have is to keep that internet, the band space free, to keep it continuously as it is now, not owned by any company, not controlled by any central authority, but owned by the people. So some political theorists are in fact saying that the new commons is the internet, and we have to learn from old struggles where the commons became privatized. We have to learn from old struggles that these new commons have to be kept free from any private ownership or interference. I think we have to bite the bullet here. It's either you're going to accept that we have to move into a socialist situation where ideas are creative. They've always been collaborative. We are an endless source of creativity. And therefore, the only thing that's stopping us from moving into a collaborative platform where we can just be happy together exchanging ideas and who cares who profits, or maybe nobody should profit anymore, is really an economic system whose logic is still profit and accumulation. That decision will be made at the individual level by individual professors. And many of us are seeing that already. We just put our works on the web. We don't care. Go ahead. Plenty more where that came from. It's like, it's a bit like we know very well that the content of what we text is created by us. We wonder why, let's say, a multinational, transnational corporation like Lever that produces Knorr is profiting from our sinigang, tamarind-based soup. You can buy it in a packet, and you wonder whether Unilever or Knorr will pay the Filipino people for our traditional knowledge in royalties. So whether we like it or not, the truth is our creativity, at the point when we want to talk to someone, text someone, do Facebook, whatever, our creativity is already a source of profit. I go back to what I'm talking about in terms of biopolitical control and the intimacy of capitalist accumulation at this stage in our modern world. So you are already giving away things for free that the big companies are profiting from. There's that schism. And you may decide as an individual, as a center, as an institution, as a university, how far you want this exploitation to continue. But I think what is interesting is that there is a greater and greater and greater disjunct between the tremendous creativity of ordinary people and the tremendous capacity of companies to profit from this creativity. But how long does this disjuncture continue? We will see. It's very interesting. And maybe, perhaps it has happened. No, it's not a perhaps. This has been going on for centuries. People have been giving things free that they could profit from for centuries as well. So I hope that trend continues. And that's just part of resistance as well. There are many things that we have to do also at the structural public level to end, massive poverty. I'm not saying giving one of my works off for free thus makes a massive blow against the poverty in the poor communities of the Philippines. But what's interesting about our understanding of the hegemonic nature of control is that it allows us also the pleasure of seeing many other activities as resistant. You point something out that's very interesting. Development never questioned the productive and reproductive processes that led to the things we were supposed to want, televisions, etc. Or even food, food and shelter and clothing. There are many ways to produce basic needs or even not basic needs. Like as a feminist, I don't mind reveling in the body's pleasures and enjoying ourselves. That's not a problem. But we need to do something that is urgent now. We have to question the process by which we produce things. Is it environmentally friendly? Does it hurt anybody else? What are the social costs of these production? So, are we producing too much that we don't really need, etc.? So, you're right about this critique of development. The other issue is then the decoupling of development as a sort of sovereign, national, macro, community, big community, city project. We're beginning to understand that if we're going to create productive processes that don't have high social costs and still meet people's basic and plus needs, it has to be local. It has to be suited to the material conditions of particular communities. So, as simple as garbage disposal, if you look at best practices, it covers a wide variety of how people can deal with their garbage at the community level. It's not one. You can have segregation this way, segregation that way, and the programs that work are rooted in the way people get together and solve their problems. So one of the interesting developments is that we are indeed having to go local, and it's so much a part also of what we've been talking about, how the new modern architecture of the world allows us great capacities for smaller individual interventions. And I think I will link that, and we can come back to it later, a new emerging concept of democracy and radical democracy. Okay, so that's the first part. We can go more local, but we're also beginning to see what we mean by people-centered development. And here here we're going back to things that have nothing to do with modern architecture, but have everything to do with good old community organizing, where you, in your embodied person, go to the community, sit with women, and talk to them. And what I've been learning from years of working also with NGOs is that development, empowerment, whatever it is you want to talk about, it is a long-term process of investment in women. We start laughing when our funding partners tell us we have to move towards self-sustainability and self-reliance, because our joke there is then we know our partners are leaving us. Because as I'm talking about one of my main NGOs, the one I've spent most of my life in, it's called Likhaan. It's a reproductive health and rights NGO. We've been Likhaan for 30 years. We used to have another name, but the office, the work, the programs, the people, many of the people who work there, who've been there from the beginning, we've been there for 20 years. Okay, so 20 years it is. And we see ourselves, therefore, as self-sustainable. And we understand, we have come to learn that the empowerment, development process is a long-term project with women. And it just makes real sense, whether you're raising children, building a family, building a group of friends or a community. You don't say in 2 years you will be empowered, right? And you don't say that there are indicators that are good for everyone. So it's also very processual. So we're very polite, and truly some of the things that the funding agencies will teach you are important to help you generate a fund base, etc. But I think questions of sustainability are better asked of those who can't stay long enough to see the empowerment process come to good measure. And I'm really hoping that we can look at indicators, processes, and viewpoints where we understand that long-term investment in people is the more important parameter that we have to use as a measure. The problem with much of the discourse that goes around women, empowerment, etc., is that you're only given the choice between painting yourself as a victim or painting yourself as an agent, when actually we know that even in the most repressive situations, you have agency. And even in the most liberated situations, you're a subject of structure. So, particularly now to the report, if you look at the indicators, some of it is a fluke. They will say, for example, literacy is one of the female literacy is one indicator. Well, traditionally, Philippines it has a high literacy rate. Even if we were the basket case of Asia, even when we were the poor, even when we were in the dictatorship, we had a very high literacy rate. It is also true, however, that Filipina women, especially the more upper class ones, do enjoy a certain level of equality and freedom that maybe other similarly upper class women in other cultures may not have. So I'm proud of our Philippine women's movement. I'm proud of the fact that we can claim that it is still one of the stronger feminist movements in the world. It has a great reputation. Even when other feminist movements in other countries were experiencing an ebb, the Filipina women's movement sort of ebbed, but not as badly. And there's a strong, exciting civil society component that has many gender advocates in it in the Philippines. So this is one of the reasons, and the strength of Filipina women can come from very mainstream government institutions all the way to grassroots women who are working every day to end criminal control of access to water and electricity. We have these wonderful stories. But the big but is, if you put in other indicators, we're probably one of the worst countries in the world for gender empowerment. And what am I speaking of? We're the only country in the world other than Malta that doesn't have divorce. And Malta is like I don't know if it's exactly a typical country, because it's very, very much Catholic, almost like an extension of the Vatican in some respects. We're the only a diminishing number of countries where abortion is prohibited under all circumstances. So in that category, we join extremely enlightened nations like those ruled by the Taliban. So this is not a good thing for Filipina women. We're a diminishing number of countries where we have no laws protecting the rights of sexual minorities. There are no clear-cut legal protections for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex peoples. And also, we are now having a struggle to just give a legal basis to reproductive health services, so they cannot just be arbitrarily taken away by any official who doesn't like contraceptives. And this has happened repeatedly over the past decade, where a government official, even the former mayor of Manila, can just decide that he will violate the Philippine Constitution and all the covenants that the Philippine government has signed on access to reproductive health and contraceptives, and refuse contraceptives in his country, in his city. So and whenever these four measures come up, you see a massive campaign by a strong church dictating on a weak state and violating the religious rights of other sectors of Philippine society, especially Filipino women. My focus in terms of what I'm really interested in is really sexuality, but from a developmental perspective. But also because aside from being a psychologist, I'm a doctor of medicine, and I began my advocacies really as an ordinary general practitioner in poor communities, trying to understand simple health problems that should be solved easily, and they don't get solved. So a lot of feminist studies has been done, and it's clearer, especially because of our orientation in the university, which has been the political economy, and our roots in the anti-dictatorship and anti-imperialist struggles, a lot of work has been done on the other track of looking at women's oppression or people's oppression in general, which is, as I said, the economy, the productive economy. My interest really has been the reproductive economy and sexuality. So that's where I would, when talking about my studies, it's that approach that I am more interested in, and it has led to many things. The issue about the church is just one of those that gets tied up with the interest in sexuality, because the church has a very different view of women, has a very different view of sexuality from views that I think will help empower women, liberate women and their families.